So I'll use affirmative action now, because the discussion is going, it's an academic discussion roughly, which is undoubtedly very interesting and very necessary, but we have a lot of people from Ukraine who came from different parts of Ukraine, and I think they're more interested in what out of this that they've heard can be applied and how can it be applied. If perhaps we could ask to switch to short communication, short remarks. I know Yosyf wanted to say something. Can we limit it to 5 minutes, please? If we have more time, we'll add more time. But I suggest these rules of the game. And then if we have questions for time for questions, then we'll come back to questions. But Yosyf, if you would like to start, but please come out here. You need to be translated. Mr. Yosyf Zisels is activist of the advocacy movement from Soviet times and now the leader of the Jewish community of Ukraine. Hello, thank you. Very interesting presentations. I had many questions after the Ukrainian session and I couldn't voice them because there wasn't enough time. And I would like to say that what I did not hear and what I'm missing. I'm not a scholar, I'm not a historian, and so it's hard for me to get used. I don't have the command of these professional cultural codes. It took me a very long time to get used to the term narrative. Finally, I'm used to it, but when I ask, I understand that I'm not understood either. So I'm actually a theoretical physicist by my education, so I'm very interested in systems and approaches and systematic aspects, and my dissident my dissident history means that I'm also highly skeptical of many factors. But what I've been missing here, I'll try to formulate again. I didn't hear all of these interesting presentations that we've heard. I've been missing a kind of sense of context, historical context, civilizational context, these kind of systematic things that would allow me to see that private, separate problem case that was mentioned in the broader historical context. And so when we're thinking about our Ukrainian matters, our Ukrainian issues, and we're already talking about reconciliation. Okay, and we've been talking about reconciliation now for many years. Perhaps this also applies to other cases. But when the talk of reconciliation started before the hot stage of the war began, before the war itself began. We're talking about this, we've been talking about this for a long time. We've been experimenting with certain educatory methodologies. And so in my understanding that if we're serious about reconciliation, we have to picture a certain process of reconciliation rather than a result, because we see that the result is far in the distance. If you look at the civil war in the United States, they've already talked about this as an example. Still, it's been 150 years, still in some families there is that historical memory setting, family memory setting, that still hasn't united the people who have stood on either side of the civil war. Perhaps it looks different now in certain political trends, but as far as reconciliation is concerned, we have to picture a plan of this reconciliation, some sort of mechanism of this reconciliation. And I'm backtracking now. And so to understand this, we have to really analyze the nature of the conflict itself. Without understanding the nature of the conflict, the mechanisms of this conflict, the circumstances of this conflict, it will be very difficult for us. We'll be hard-pressed to come up with effective strategies and recommendations and methodologies for reconciliation, methods for reconciliation. If we want to offer this to the Ukrainian society, I understand that it's not up to historians, but again, like I said, I'm not a historian. I'm a bit of a public figure. I speak sometimes, including on television, including on themes of reconciliation. So I do some sort of activity, and then the historians will say something about this, or perhaps not even notice it. But I can't say that I'm a public intellectual, because the heroes of Ilf and Petrov said, that in Petrovsk, a person who had 10,000 rubles was a millionaire. But it's interesting that the nature of the conflict, and when we think about the nature of our conflict, I suggested this 10 years ago. We had the round table at our institute, the Institute for Nationality Studies and Political Science. Everybody knows this institute, the former Kuras Institute. We did a round table on problems of civilizational identity, and we invited the best historians, philosophers, sociologists, psychologists who we could find then in Ukraine. And we had this interdisciplinary look at, the civilizational identity didn't really cause much enthusiasm. It wasn't received with much enthusiasm. Everybody was kind of vacillating when they started talking. Then they moved to their professional field where they felt comfortable. And so this means that this is something that we don't yet fully understand. Perhaps it wasn't yet time to talk about. It hadn't been time to talk about it then. Now, in discussing our conflict, we understand that from the first Maidan, that student Maidan, that development of the Ukrainian Revolution, which started, the modern stage in 1991, then 2004, now 13, 14, now it's 2016. So we see that back in 2004 we started talking about what the nature of this conflict is, and since it had certain aspects, it was multidimensional. It had an interethnic aspect, it had an interreligious aspect, interlinguistic aspect. Now it has a territorial aspect as well, and other aspects. And as far as when we say that the conflict has multiple aspects, we can attempt a hypothesis. We can say that this is a civilizational conflict because it has multiple aspects, but not a single aspect completes what this is. I know that historians will be very skeptical of what I say, but this is a model that allows me as a physicist and dissident to understand the times in which we live, what was before us and what will come after us. And so this civilizational conflict that passes through Ukraine, I'm not saying it's not passing through Dnipro, it's not going along the lines of Huntington or Engelhardt. This fault line goes through every citizen of Ukraine for many generations now. Ukraine, by virtue or by fault of it being between two very strong identity centers, namely the European one and Eurasian one. So I'm trying to get a sense in these presentations of the echo of the civilization conflict in which we inhabit at the moment. Because maybe these are more political phrases, that this is not a war, this is not a civil war, this is not even war between Ukraine and Russia. This is a war between Europe and Eurasia, which is now personified in our conflict. Actually, it's a much broader war. Now, it's very important for us to understand. And then another reminiscence, another memory from my dissident days. I remember being very surprised, very stricken. I was in the Ukrainian National Democratic Movement, but I'm not Ukrainian, I'm Jewish. So I had this kind of slightly outsider perspective on the conversations and the life of my comrades in arms, the political prisoners and others. And I saw a certain problem for myself. I was speaking from the point of view of human rights, but I understood that for many national democrats, I'm not even talking about nationalists, the previous stage, the armed struggle. I'm talking about the national democrats. Human rights were more of the form than the essence of their identity, their personal identity. The identity was the national identity. That was the point, that was the gist. What does this mean that it was purely a form? It means that many of my friends, I call them my friends, to this day, although many of them are gone, they wouldn't have minded a national authoritarian regime, even a national dictatorship. 1991 for them was more of a sufficient factor for them to say, we're great, we're fine now. As a mathematician, I stressed that 1991, this outward independence is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for Ukraine to become a democracy and economically developed and a civilized state, regardless of whether or not it joins the European Union. So this is the thing that I've heard a little bit kind of not indirectly, but I didn't get a good sense of this. And when I talk about this civilizational identity, I look at the map of Engelhardt and I see that this is the reality. Which is why I was asking, well, what about these aspects, these factors that, we're Slavs, that we're Orthodox, this is Orthodox Christianity, Eastern Christianity. How does that affect the culture of memory, the nature of conflict, and the run of these conflicts, the flow of these conflicts. And so how do we, in these specific identity conditions, how do we get rid of these conflicts such that the mechanisms of memory are set in work? If you remember the map of Engelhardt, all of the post-communist and all of the Orthodox countries grouped together, and so this is not for nothing. It's not a coincidence, because for 3,000 years people have been watching volcano eruptions and typhoons and tsunamis and earthquakes, and they're thinking this is some kind of divine participation. And then later, hundreds of years later, the physics and geophysics explain that it actually is an ocean of magma and there are continents floating atop, and this is where these seismic situations arise with continents, and that's why you have the earthquake or a volcanic eruption. And I'm trying to get a sense of this in social processes, even though I understand that history and social processes, is not physics or mathematics. But I want to get a sense of these profound movements, profound quakes, that identity matrix of each of the peoples, nations, each of the so to speak continents, which we don't understand every day, we don't feel it every day, we don't explain it, but it really works. Because when we say, well, there are many mistakes, like Oksana said, the mistakes in the politics of memory, but the mistakes are not just in the politics of memory. We have constant mistakes. Take any direction, take any field. When we were just talking with Yushchenko in 2007, that xenophobia is on the rise in Ukraine, and I said, I can't say that you're prejudiced in this regard, that you're not doing anything about this, because you have the same sort of attitude to other areas of life. It's very superficial, very non-systemic. So it's very important to understand these movements that define our errors. If these errors are systemic, if they're not contingent, like a mistake, an error is a contingency. If it's systemic, then maybe it can be determined, maybe not 100% determined, but determined by some kind of internal aspects, the seismic movements of the continents inside the society. And so, yes, wrapping up. So when you talk about consensus, Yaroslav, I understand this differently, because I think that 55, 65, 75% of people is a consensus. It's more of a compromise. It's a compromise when everybody's somewhat displeased. Both sides are somewhat dissatisfied. So right now, we have more or less of a ceasefire, and we're dissatisfied that we didn't manage to complete the military tasks, and these separatists, whom we call collaborators, are also they don't think that they've resolved their tasks, so they're also dissatisfied. This is not a consensus, even if we have 70% of people. Consensus is 100%, and so we can talk about certain compromises in our society, but we have very different roots for different regions in Ukraine, different identity, and it's not a problem. I'm concluding now. It's not a problem to live with different identities, no, but you have to understand this, because there are countries where people even with different civilizational choices and identities live. I'm not even talking about religious and ethnic. You can't impose your own model of identity on others. You can't force others to carry that culture of memory that you carry or your friends carry. You can't impose that on somebody else. You can't impose your way of life, because they might have a more conservative one, but we can learn to live together, and this will be the pluralism that so much has been said about as a pluralism of memory. And so when you look at us, don't look at what our authorities do, the president, the prime minister. The main factor of our life today is the civil society. It's the civil society that won in 2004 and 2013-14. It is that actor that determines our main processes. This is the young Ukraine germinating and growing through this very superficial, very difficult conservative layer of slavery or serfdom or holodomor or all of the violence and annihilation of Ukraine. Has created a certain layer that it's difficult for this new Ukraine to back through, which will also be more pluralistic. We can't agree with our people that have their own memory. They have their own memory, we have our own, but we can hope that our children or maybe our grandchildren will be better equipped or better aimed, and that's why we're working today. We're working with the same generation that 20, 30 years down the road will come to power, possibly in Ukraine, and perhaps it will be a factor of civil society and other processes, and they'll have a different conception of culture. Thank you. More.
But only 5 minutes, please. Please confine your speech to 5 minutes. We are approaching the end of our conference. We are going to have a meeting of our committee right after the end of the conference. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. This discussion is infinite, and we can spend another 10 days here because it's very relevant not only for Ukraine but all over the world. I just want to make a couple of statements. I'm really grateful to all the speakers who addressed all the issues in question from the top, from the social level, from the political level, from the level of civil society, but we did not really talk about what is happening at the bottom. And we want to understand what is happening at the bottom, at the lower level. We need to understand what kind of memory we're talking about. There are a lot of different types of history, social, scientific, household, family, etc., etc., etc. This list goes on and on. So we need to understand in the first place what kind of history we're talking about, and only then can we talk about its influence. My second statement: what is memory that we are discussing within this conference? Memory is about myths and stereotypes. Ultimately, the obtained, the acquired myths and stereotypes, and as you understand, myths and stereotypes last long. There's relevant research that I don't want to refer to right now. And what do we mean by myths and stereotypes? They shape the ideological space for our activities and operations. So whenever we talk about ideology, we mean a conflict of ideologies, a conflict of myths and stereotypes, a conflict of ideologies that we should evaluate and assess from different viewpoints. What can the conflict of ideologies result in? Can ideologies reconcile? It's obvious then it's not possible. They can maybe come to terms for some time, but they cannot completely reconcile. What is the most important thing in this context? Values, because values allow us to separate different ideologies like totalitarian, authoritarian ideologies from appropriate ideologies that can be well perceived and accepted in the pluralistic space. If we do not incorporate this factor of values in our discussion, then we can allow for the crazy ones, for idiots, for perpetrators, for criminals. So we need to set some sort of bar that will be a separating factor to separate bad ideologies from appropriate ideologies. Facts. We've been talking a lot about facts. From the point of view of historiographic and methodological analysis, there are no facts. We can have only interpretations of facts because epistemology says that whenever you describe facts, you already interpret them. Facts cannot be a panacea to combat myths, stereotypes, and different types of ideologies. And my last premise, because of course I can talk for hours in a row about each statement of mine, what can we do? What should we do? I think the best thing to do, and this is something that Professor Rysak said and Professor Kubik said, it would be better to deal with other things, not history, but like reforms and some other important matters. But unfortunately, it's not possible. It's because without historical knowledge, without the knowledge of myths and stereotypes, not a single society and community can exist. Therefore, in this context, history plays the role of identification and legitimization. And I agree with Professor Kubik here. And neither an individual nor a society can exist without history. What to do if we have different myths and stereotypes? Should we reconcile? Should we come to terms? Well, maybe not even, maybe not the term reconciliation, but approximation, coming closer to each other and separating whatever is not in line with the present. Like one example, a catastrophic example, the representative poll conducted in July 2015 on the territory of Ukraine, excluding the Crimea and the occupied territories of Ukraine, showed that despite the 2 years of aggression and 25 years of independence, 54% of the respondents, I'm not talking about the occupied territories, 54% of interviewed Ukrainians believe that Russia is still very close or a close state. 67.7, just remember 67.7, 2/3 of the interviewed Ukrainians state that the Russian language and culture are close to them and they cannot imagine their lives without the Russian language and culture. So these myths and stereotypes in the Ukrainian context are so deeply rooted that if we do not eliminate them, or if we do not put them aside, if we do not replace them with new myths and stereotypes, and you can replace them with whatever, pluralistic or any other myths and stereotypes, but without that, the process of reconciliation is not possible. It's bad without history, it's bad with history, but it's not possible without history. So we need to fight a little bit before we reconcile, right? So war first and then only peace. Oleksandr Lysenko is a member of our committee, so he also wants to say a couple of words. Thank you very much for having allowed me to make my short speech. I will try to be very concise, but I want to finish with some practical tips and proposals. I want to rethink the bitter past and experience. Last year, we discussed the book of Wesley. It's a writer who tried to understand what his father experienced in the times of World War II. He was on the Eastern Front, and the writer suspected that his father was involved in the extermination of the Jews. His father was a fervent supporter of the Nazi ideology, but on the deathbed, he opened this secret box that each of us has inside, and his son had the civil boldness to write this book and tell the story of his grandfather, of his father. So I have this image of the secret personal box that we have inside us, and maybe we can use this image for our discussions at personal, group and collective levels. I think that the realistic way forward for Ukraine is to learn to talk through our past and experiences. So we need to remember something out loud. We need to articulate our fears and concerns. We do not have any practice of public self-criticism, of public remembrance. We are deeply, we are full of complexes and low self-esteem. One more way out is the discrediting of destructive commemorative practices that are imposed by politicians. We can see that as soon as a new political force comes to power, new technologies, new pathways emerge. So you need to go this way, you need to follow this path, you can discuss this issue only in this direction. And I don't want to criticize my colleague in this context because he is a personality, he can express his own opinions, but the Institute of National Remembrance, headed by different directors, offered different approaches depending on who was the director of the institute. And I think that our way forward is not to have discussions within the governmental field, but we also need to involve broad civil society organizations. And I agree with one of the speakers who said that science is the front line that we need to use to attack the state political leaders and figures. I think that we need to be offensive, we need to be expansion oriented, and we need to be provocative, because the state always freezes this process. The state leaders are not interested in controversies and conflicts. So I don't want to say that I propose conformism, but I agree that we all are different, but the awareness of this diversity and reconciliation should take place in the civil society domain. And one more point, the last point that I want to make. Condemnation of the previous traumatic experience, the condemnation of communism or some other traumatic past that we have, should happen through understanding. You cannot forcefully impose unanimous thinking. Mr. Zinchenko, who is the Deputy Director of the Institute of National Remembrance. Well, I'm not really Deputy Director, I am an advisor to the Director of the Institute of National Remembrance. First of all, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to all the participants of the conference. I've been fascinated by the presentations of our panelists, great speeches, thank you very much. And I was particularly fascinated by the work of our organizers, Yaroslav, Igor, thank you very much for having invited me to this conference and for the great time that we have had together. Special thanks to our fantastic interpreters, because they've been interpreting on a high level, in particular simultaneous interpreting from the Polish language into the English language, which was happened impromptu. And now I want to make some points. Unfortunately, you cannot see my presentation on the screen. Well, maybe you can describe the slide. Maybe we do not need to see anything. Just describe it, because we're just wasting our time. Or maybe while you're getting ready, some other participant can say something. Maybe Oksana wants to say something. Oksana Mikheeva. She works for the Ukrainian Catholic University, but she's from the Donbass originally. She's a professor of sociology, but at the same time historian, which is even better. So she's a doctor of historical science. And I want to talk a little bit about sociology, because we've had 2 saturated days, a lot of ideas, a wide array of thoughts that I noted down. But I want to finish with some practical steps, practical tips, because I have some experience of interviewing IDPs, and we mentioned this briefly within our conference. And I already have a base for another survey, in-depth interviews with those people who voluntarily got involved in the military conflict, and we explored both parties, the Ukrainian, pro-Ukrainian volunteers and the Ukrainian separatists. I have just raw data, but so I cannot really make any final conclusions, but I can share some preliminary observations. The first thing that struck me when I had a look at the findings of the interviews with both parties, they are not just conflicting, they are not in opposition, they are completely opposite and different, which means that the propaganda machine worked on both sides, and the mirror character of these interviews means that dialogue as a form of reconciliation will not work and will not yield the positive effect that we expected to yield. So we cannot count on constructive dialogue. And my colleagues that conduct a number of workshops and bring together different participants from the Ukrainian side, from the separatist side, they tell me that this dialogue does not work. Another point is related to facts, how to work with them, how to refer to facts. The matter is that we asked our respondents how they describe what happened. They, as direct participants and witnesses of the events, and as a result I started thinking, can we be talking about facts as such? Is there some realistic, adequate perception of reality? Just imagine that you live in a big city and there's a meeting or demonstration taking place somewhere. You might have been there just for 10 minutes, you might have passed by, you don't even understand what is happening. You came back home, you switched on your TV or you went online, and then you made a post, and this way you contributed your piece to the interpretation of the reality. So we don't know how to answer the question what really happened, because you have as many answers as there are people that are involved in this conflict. One more important point, an alerting point based on our survey, but once again I'm talking about those people that are actively involved in defending and protecting their interests, their ideas, their state. And once again we interviewed both pro-Ukrainian volunteers and separatists. Ukrainians protect Ukrainian society, the idea of the Ukrainian statehood, and they are very critical about the state as a political institution. But the same can be observed on the side of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. These regimes are not viewed as independent regimes, they are perceived as puppet regimes. So the interviewees were very critical about these regimes, but once again they said that they protect their own interests and ideas. And one last point, and which fills me with hope, we asked one more question, what the people are going to do next, and what rights do they see, because you can easily delegate this right to violence. What is my vision of the picture? Everything still remains within the legal field. People remain law-abiding, and people at least do not articulate their desire to take arms into their hands. These people demonstrate readiness to go back to their normal life, and people articulate and communicate their desire to continue living within the framework of a normal society. And now back to advisor to the Institute of National Remembrance. So why do I want to show this map? We have already seen this map in Professor Hrycak's presentation, but some other issues were raised in that context. But this map is always relevant. The contours of the elections of 2010 or some other elections, or for example, what Ukrainians think their native tongue is, we can see the split between the Ukrainian language being declared as a native tongue and the Russian language. If we have a look at the map of the 17th century, the first half of the 17th century, we will see that these contours are more or less the same. So this is it's basically we have this continuity, lengthy, long time continuity that we can basically observe since the beginning of the 17th century. And a question occurs in this regard: what can we do with these divisions, with this split? And this is the practical part of my short speech that Mr. Zisels mentioned. So we need to come up with some sort of action plan how we can overcome all the issues related to our attitude towards the past. As we can see, all these attitudes have various effects on our life today, in particular when we're talking about political elections whose results are determined by our mindsets. But nevertheless, I agree that we need some sort of action plan. After this conference, I will spare about 2 weeks to prepare the first draft of this action plan, and then of course this action plan will be discussed within a narrow group of experts that are not only historians but also sociologists or civil society activists that are related to collective communication. Only then will this draft action plan submitted for general discussions and debates. But there are some problematic issues here. There are a lot of other chapters, for example, the borders of 1933 between the Second Zhezpospolita and the Soviet Union, basically the territory where we are located right now. These are interesting chapters of our history, different visions of the past and different visions for the future, and different traumatic pasts. As a result, one of the Ukrainian problems is traumas of the past that do not allow us to fully leverage and tap into the Spanish experience. So our problem is that we don't really have the ability to forgive. Or maybe this is our problem, the ability to forgive. The Ukrainian ethnos was destroyed in the Soviet times, and the further to the east, the worse the situation is. Forgiveness, it's not the ability of the strong ones, but the fate of the weak ones. So I'm the big boss and you're stupid, you're an idiot. This is our popular reality, and we have numerous traumas of the past like that. So it's the issue of trust or lack of trust and fear that blocks the creative power of the Ukrainian people for many decades. Individualism that was basically destroyed by the totalitarian regime and cultivation of collectivism. But I think that maybe we should switch back to individualism. It's all about respect, dignity and disrespect, initiative and conformism. So all these antagonist values are a problem for our future development. And one more important point is that this change is already beginning to take place. The collapse of the totalitarian regime, its extermination is a factor that will help Ukraine transform. And one interesting observation, over 50% of Ukrainians this year, and this is something that is fixed this year by sociological surveys, do not feel nostalgia for the Soviet Union. This is the first year in our independence when the number of people that are nostalgic about the Soviet Union is smaller than the number of people who are not. Could you wrap up, please? Well, wrapping up and summarizing this story, I do believe in the power of dialogue, but at the same time I think that it should be stimulated, and one of the ways to encourage this dialogue is the law on the condemnation of totalitarian regimes, and one of the conditions of this law is to change the names related and associated with the totalitarian regime. This will stimulate discussion. As a result of a discussion, we will have certain issues singled out, and then we can have constructive dialogue around what is evil, what is good. But this is our task for the next 10, 12, 15 years if we want to have this dialogue about values and then be more successful. Well, I think that we need to have an argument first and then reconcile, because it's just one of the past, one of the civilizational maps. Dnipropetrovsk is not there, Odessa is not there, so the situation has already changed. If believe me that we could have a different map right now. If this map was in line with the reality, we would be in a different position. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for having provided me with the opportunity to participate in this great conference. I will be very succinct, just a couple of words about this possibility of dialogue. I represent the Odessa part of the dialogue, and I'm a member of the dialogue group supported by the Odessa Regional Mediation Group. I can see that this dialogue is already underway. Whether it's successful or not is a different question, but at least we are trying to incorporate the historical component into this dialogue, and we have all sorts of members within our group, IDPs, local representatives, civil society activists. And just a couple of words about the project that we have been implementing over the last half year in Odessa, reflecting on what we mean by the reconciliation of memories. We thought that it's not just a mediation project that will bring together representatives of different viewpoints. For us, it's more about building a new vision of the history, and we decided to stem from the regional perspective. And we decided that reconciliation is possible if we create an asymmetric view on the history of a particular region, and everyone will have their own voice. Because if at least some actors of our history are not involved and do not have a voice, then we cannot be talking about proper historical memory. And we stemmed from the fact that the diversity, existential commonalities of the territory, that territory where we feel as being at home, because we have connections with people that lived on the same territory. They had different paths, different routes. So this way we can build an asymmetric view of history and reconcile different memories. And it turned out that with this perspective, even if we are talking about some tragic events, we can reconcile. So at the level of our region, we tried to make this first endeavor, and I must admit that we find the largest number of the like-minded in the city of Lviv. And after we had our seminar in the city of Lviv, we left with the impression of having had a very friendly discussion. But when we went to Kharkiv, to Dnipropetrovsk, and then the situation got back to normal. So unfortunately, I don't really have a lot of time to tell you more about this project, but I just wanted to briefly tell you about this project. If it's of interest to you, you are welcome to join. And the last speech, Viktoria Brynza, sociologist and a member of the Nestor group that is responsible for the development of the vision of the city of Lviv. Thank you, dear colleagues. I'm a sociologist, and it's of the utmost importance for me that this conference has an interdisciplinary character, because we can have different views on the same phenomenon or the same social processes. I just want to make a couple of remarks that I think are important in the context of my research. The current situation of the Ukrainian society that feels the need for reconciliation, not only from the point of view of interaction of different cultures, but also from the point of view of time interaction. Because there's a switch from industrial to post-industrial to informational epoch. And in this light, I would like to point out that our education system, that is a part of the values cultivation process, remains unreformed since the Soviet times, and the public administration system remains unreformed as well, which means that in secondary schools, and recently we had a study there on freedom. So in our secondary schools, we still continue transmitting the only right viewpoint on specific events. Therefore, we understand now that certain domineering ideological aspects, like the interpretation of certain events, still remain in our schools. So we still have this prevailing principles of transmitting the only right viewpoint. Our pupils and students are not really encouraged to express their own opinions and to develop their critical thinking skills, and this has its toll on public discussions, on civil society discussions, and on scientific and research developments. We have had a lot of scandals about plagiarism in science and research, but nevertheless these people remain on their posts despite the social and societal resonance. Unfortunately, I did not participate in the first part of our conference. I will definitely have a look at all the presentations and papers that were presented. But how can we know that reconciliation took place? Are there any specific stages of reconciliation that we can outline? For example, there's something that will allow us to say that we have already covered 20% of the reconciliation pathway. And my assumption is that one of such elements of reconciliation, and this is something that we as activists, intellectuals, historians, and scholars, we need to recognize that we ourselves are the products of the Soviet school, when we are not ready to hear other voices, other opinions, when we are not ready to filter through things, when we are not ready to separate the old ideology from the essence. And I think that it makes sense to channel our scientific discussion into this direction. So we need to rethink the role of education, and it can become one of the substantial pillars for reconciliation. Thank you very much. Would anyone like to say anything? If not, then I'm really grateful for your participation and for your patience. I know very well that this last bit of our conference has been really gruesome for you. I can see it in your eyes. So we really appreciate that you stayed here until the very end. Before we need to become martyrs before we develop further. Once again, a big thank you to our interpreters. I think they've worked most hard.